institutions supporting ISPI and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on this Med 2016 dialogue, and delighted to see that so many people have been able to join everyone again here today for this discussion. We're here to talk about the big topic of the future of Syria, and specifically the title of this panel, which is "Where do we go from here? A path to a political solution." And I'm delighted to have with us here today Staffan de Mistura, United Nations Special Envoy to Syria, and of course Federica Mogherini, EU High Representative for Foreign Security Policy and a Vice President of the European Commission, two people perfectly placed to discuss this extremely difficult topic. And we only have a limited amount of time. I'm sure we will have quick signals from people that we need to finish up quickly, so I'm not going to spend any more time in diplomatic niceties. Let me get straight to the issue. For those of you who were here for the previous panel chaired by Marta Dassou on the future of US foreign policy, I took away one specific thing, Staffan, Federica, which was this may be a US administration that's going to pivot back to the Middle East. If it does pivot back to the Middle East, and from what we heard so far, we already have a Trump president-elect running foreign policy from Trump Tower, as far as I can tell, in advance of being inaugurated, with the carefully staged phone calls around the world. But what seems to be appearing here is a move to, as it was described by Walter Russell Mead, brutal realism, transactional foreign policy, one in which Iran may be the country that is feared the most in the Middle East, where the US returns to traditional allies. This potentially changes the context for Syria fundamentally. And I want to start with you, Staffan. You've been valiantly pushing towards a political solution. You've supported, encouraged, and wanted to rely on the ability of the United States and Russia to help drive that process. As you watch the current situation, do you think a potential rapprochement politically between the presidents of Russia and the United States is a moment of opportunity? Or what sort of peace potentially emerges if it's the Kerry-Lavrov peace that does not go forward, but a different one in the new administration? How do you see that key bilateral relationship influencing the context for the UN's role?
Well, first of all, it's true. We have been all working on an assumption, and for the whole year. Assumption one is that President Obama, and definitely John Kerry, who has been putting so much energy in it, and you could see it yesterday, have been pushing very hard after the Iranian deal in order to find a way to reduce violence, fight Daesh, and in this context, trying to push for a political process. And that is part of the legacy of President Obama's attempt. And I must say, he will be probably doing that until the last day of his own tenure, and the same for John Kerry. On that basis, the next assumption was, and still is, that Russia, being involved in Syria, had no interest in getting engaged forever in Syria, and therefore getting tangled in an endless conflict, and probably getting into the syndrome, you break it, you own it. In other words, having to be part of the maintenance, reconstruction, stabilization of Syria. And in that sense, the two countries had a lot in common for a period. But unfortunately, it didn't work like that. Except once, on the 26th of February, when we did have a major ceasefire, because the two sides agreed that it was the time to do so. And it worked. And it worked for several months, 3 months. But then spoilers on both sides made it not happen. One is al-Nusra, and let's be frank, the other one was the government of Bashar Assad, who obviously didn't have a keen interest in having a peace deal that early, wanted to see a military advance in order to perhaps have a peace deal. And the last chance was the 9th of September. It was a good chance, believe me. It was a good chance. They actually agreed until midnight, and it was a serious discussion. And the deal was local but global. It was reduction of violence, detaching al-Nusra, which has been the constant ambiguity affecting all of us. How can we be looking at al-Nusra as a fighting force against Bashar Assad while it is, at the same time, frankly, Al-Qaeda? And grounding the Syrian Air Force. If he had worked, it would have made a big difference. He didn't. Again, because spoilers, 2 major incidents. So we are where we are now. Bottom line, I don't know what is the position of President Trump. We will be going to New York and Washington soon, and I think we will have some idea, and we will see more of that. One thing we know is what President Trump has been saying publicly. His idea is he wants to make a deal with President Putin regarding fighting Daesh. I think, we all think, I want to believe, we agree. We want to see Daesh fought. They are our common enemy. This is what has been happening in Brussels, has been happening in Germany, everywhere around, France. But the big issue and the big question that I would like to ask President Trump and his team when we meet his team would be, fine, I think no one in the world will disagree with you that in Syria and in Iraq, the priority should be fighting Daesh. Fighting or winning Daesh. Fighting or defeating Daesh. If you say defeating Daesh, then remember the lesson we learned in Iraq and in Libya. We need to find a political inclusive solution that includes those who feel disenfranchised, particularly Sunni communities in Iraq and certainly in Syria. If that doesn't take place, then you will be fighting together, but will not be defeating. So bottom line, regardless of whether there is a military victory or a non-military victory in Syria, you still need a push for a political, inclusive, real solution, including the region. This is a proxy war. It needs to be a proxy peace too.
Just before we move to the potential for a solution afterwards, it would appear at the moment that there's a very good chance that Aleppo could fall, and that therefore President Assad will feel he won. Victory is going to be a relative term in this sort of a terrible, brutal conflict. But if that is the case, surely that makes the context for a political solution and a political future of Syria much more different. We're more likely to end with a less inclusive outcome in the end, potentially if Aleppo falls. What's your feeling about the situation in Aleppo specifically at the moment, one which, of course, you've put so much personal effort into?
Well, there are 2 sides there. One is the situation in Aleppo, you're right. We've been saying all together, for how long, including me, that there is a need for a political solution, and there is no other military solution. But let's be frank, reality politics sometimes prevails on idealpolitik. And what we are seeing is actually military acceleration. De facto, what we have seen in Aleppo has been a reduction of the resistance in eastern Aleppo, perhaps also thanks to some type of informal negotiation which have reduced the level of fighting. But the fact is that Aleppo is not going to stay that long. I was fearing it would be a terrible battle ending up by Christmas, New Year. I hope the battle will not take place, that there will be some type of formula. But now comes the next point, what you are saying. Is this going to be an occasion for the government to say, we won the war, and therefore no need of negotiation? I hope not. Because you see, you know probably, in Italy we have a good experience about Pyrrhic victories. And Pyrrho very rightly said after the second victory against the Romans, so at that time were the super empire, the superpower, one more victory like this and we have done. Now I want to believe, and that's why I count so much on the Russian influence here and the Iranian influence too, those who have a capacity of influencing Bashar Assad. Now is the time to negotiate. But negotiate in the real terms, which means power sharing. Otherwise, the alternative could be no major conflict, but a creeping, ongoing guerrilla. And no reconstruction. That's not what anyone wants. I don't think Russia wants it, and frankly, no one else wants it. That's the work we have to do now.
Thank you very much. Federica Mogherini, if I can turn to you now, because I think this looking beyond the conflict is a space where you in particular have been putting a lot of effort. The EU, it strikes me, is caught between two roles. One, trying to work on the humanitarian side, do its part to reduce the suffering not only in Syria, but very importantly among its neighbors. But I think you've also been engaged in some diplomacy trying to look post-conflict. The context is somewhat different, perhaps, now for a post-conflict environment, one in which Russia may feel strengthened, Iran may feel strengthened. If that is the case, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia may feel that, yet again, it's been on the wrong side of a deal that's being struck. Can you just take us a little bit into how you're thinking through the next steps, rather than just the today and the crisis of the moment? How are you balancing this perhaps accelerated look towards a post-conflict environment?
Well, first of all, indeed, the European Union is not a military player on the ground. This is also maybe why this ticket, EU-UN, works so well, because indeed we might lack the military leverage where the conflict is the hot one, but for the European Union, for sure, we are the humanitarian player. Through UN agencies, through international NGOs, the European Union and member states are the ones that are behind all aid delivered in Syria and around Syria. 9 billion euros invested so far in this. So whenever I'm asked, what are you doing on Aleppo or on humanitarian? Well, you should ask who else is doing, because all the things that are moving in and around Syria on humanitarian are out of our work. So where are the others? That's my question. And we will continue, because it's our interest and it's also a must for us. While Trump might reflect on brutal realism, the European Union is based on principled pragmatism. We refer to that in our global strategy. There are differences. There might be also some points in common, but for us, principles and also a certain degree of pragmatism is what guides us in the region as well. So humanitarian aid is the emergency, is the immediate, and is a long-standing work that the European Union is doing and will continue to do. But with Staffan in this year, we've worked on the diplomatic and the political track enormously. Let me say that I believe that it's exactly the deal we've done on the nuclear program of Iran that has allowed that window of consensus in the Security Council for the first time since the war started, and the ceasefire, the cessation of hostilities in February. Because after the Iran deal in July, in September in the UN General Assembly, we managed to put together a framework for the first time, having all the regional powers and the international powers around the table to try and sort the political solution out. Staffan has remembered how it worked in the beginning, how it's working less, let's say, now. Also because of changes happening here and there, and mainly now, I would say, across the Atlantic. In the European Union, we believe that we cannot abandon the political track, and we cannot make the political track hostage of the military dynamics on the ground. Because so far, we have always worked on the assumption that first you have a cessation of hostilities that allows the humanitarian aid, and then you create the political conditions for having the political talks. Maybe it's time to sound the ground with the regional powers and also with international players on what kind of future Syria could have, even in the moment when the fight still is going on in Aleppo and elsewhere. Many conflicts have found political solutions, negotiating solutions, even during the fighting. So what we have started, in agreement with Staffan and with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, with the mandate of the Foreign Affairs Council in the European Union, all the EU heads of state and government, I've started to reach out to all our regional friends. And the European Union is well positioned for that because we talk to everybody. We're friends to everybody in the region. I've started visits in Tehran, in Riyadh, started talks with Turkey, with Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, I'm sure Emirates, Qatar, all the regional actors that no matter what happens in Washington or Moscow, still live next door and will never, never afford forgetting it. Because, you know, Europe and the Middle East, we share the same sea.
Yeah.
Today it's quite self-evident. And those that live around Syria will have, in any case, to work on this proxy peace and the reconstruction and the reconciliation. That at a certain moment will come. So we've started this work. I'm very much encouraged because I see that there are common grounds, common lines that can emerge from these talks. We're not looking for ministerial formats. We're not looking for photo opportunities. We're doing it very discreetly, bilaterally. But we started to reflect with all the neighbors and all the regional powers on three fundamental questions. What kind of future Syria is a Syria that all the regional powers can live with the day after the conflict finishes? This to say, the future of Syria will have to be decided by Syrians, but the regional powers will have to allow the Syrians to use this space. So we need the regional powers not to decide on the future of Syria, but to agree on what is the, how do you say it in English, the perimeter.
Yeah, the perimeter, or the parameters.
Among, within which a solution could be acceptable to them. What kind of form of government, what kind of role for the president or the parliament, what kind of decentralization, what kind of system can allow all the different components of the Syrian society to be part of an ownership the day after the conflict. Second, the reconciliation. How can we help the Syrians that sometimes look to me wiser than us? I met the other day the Women Advisory Board that is helping the UN in this process. Let me tell you, they come from very different backgrounds, completely different political opinions, but among them, they find some common ground. Maybe they can advise regional and international powers wisely on how we can find some basic common lines on the future. So how can we help and empower what is left of the civil society in Syria to find bridges, to find ways of living together, heal the wounds of a long war? Because at the end of the day in Italy we know that, well, reconciliation after such a long war is needed, and it's the most difficult part. Having people living together after having killed each other for so long. Third, what kind of reconstruction we can work on with, for Syria? Because in Moscow or in Washington, someone could think, it's broken, not my problem. For Europeans, for the Arab world, for Turkey, for Iran, for Iraq, for name it, we cannot afford having a black hole there. So in any case, we will have to work on reconstruction, but Staffan is perfectly right on this. And no reconstruction will start if it doesn't go hand in hand with reconciliation, with the power sharing, with the political transition in Damascus that would unite the country and allow all the regional powers and the European Union, which is not only a global power, but also in this case a regional power, because we are part of the region. Only a political transition, only a political solution, only a reconciliation process, only a power sharing mechanism will allow us to work on the reconstruction of the country. And we want to do this together with our friends in the region, because we've started, and I'll stop here, we started to see how much it will cost. None of us together, not even together, if not with an incredible mobilization from the international community and all the resources that European Union and others in the region can mobilize, will ever make it. Because we're talking about an amount of money that is beyond imagination. So we have a leverage there. I'll be very pragmatic. We have a leverage there. We can use it, but we need this to go hand in hand with power sharing and a transition.
And if, just very briefly, if in essence we are not in a position, we, the EU, is not in a position to call those terms. This is a government that's been willing to allow its people to be massacred, in many cases has massacred its people, in order to achieve an objective. It's working on a very different set of calculus. It's the survival of the regime, and as they see it, therefore, the interests of their people. This is a brutal type of calculus that the EU may not be so good at playing at. What if the transition is the Assad regime and President Assad remains in power indefinitely?
You know, Staffan also was right when saying, look at the conflicts we have had in the region already, and we have to learn our lessons. You can win a war, but you can lose the peace. Does the regime or the countries that are supporting currently the regime, do they really want to win a war on a zero-sum game approach? Is it convenient for them? Is it convenient even for the regime? Mm-hmm. How do you fix a country after 6 years of war and Daesh and Nusra presence in it, and a region that is not the most stable one, if I can use a euphemism? Do you want a confrontational kind of approach also when you try to move out of the conflict itself? Or do you want to find some ground for win-win solutions? Do you want to unite, or do you want to fight, to run the peace still fighting? Running the peace still fighting is not a way of having a country. I don't say having a functional country. I don't say even having a country. Look at how we are struggling with other situations in the region, or even far away from the region. So what I say is not based on principles, even if we have strong ones, and especially when it comes to Aleppo and the protection of civilians. I'll come back to that later. But even looking at interest, who has the interest of winning a war in Syria and getting as a prize a country that is divided, armed, full of terrorists, surrounded by complicated countries, in some cases areas of conflict, and isolated, if not worse, from an international point of view? Is this convenient?
Logically, one would say no. Syria, you know the region well. A cantonized Syria? I mean, Lebanon has had to come to some type of solution after most brutal wars into a system of power sharing. But can you see some sort of power sharing? Is it in one government, or is it a cantonized split Syria that we might be looking at in the long term?
Okay, first of all, as you do know, I've been myself involved both in the Iraq conflict and in the Afghanistan crisis. In both cases, and the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, my friend from Iraq, is warmly welcome here. I'm glad to see him here. And in both cases, there was a moment during the conflict in Iraq and in Afghanistan when the question came up, perhaps we should be facilitating a separation. You know, after all, the northern Iraq is Kurdish, in the south they are the Shia, Anbar is Sunni. Why not trying to take a picture of this? No way. Iraq, wahid, the country is one. Same in Afghanistan. If we start to opening this Pandora box, it's over. Secondly, the Syrian people, you should meet more of them, and I know you do. They are proud people. They believe in their country. They love their country. They don't want to be a refugee. And if you ask them, they will say, we want to be one country. Now, what type of country is the issue that Federica was referring to? When I saw President Assad the first time, I told him, I can say it now because we are getting into the end of the year of analysis, I said, Mr. President, I hope that you don't think at night or sleep at night and think that after 5 years of war, 400,000 people killed, 1 million wounded, 4 million refugees, we just say the war is over, kulu tamam, everything is fine, malesh in Arabic, never mind, we go back to normal life. Abadan, impossible in Arabic. Yeah. You have to go back to a different environment, a political, inclusive, new process. You can win a battle, you can even think that you win a war, but you have to win the peace. And we are there for that. But it's now the time.
If I could come back to you now, Federica Mogherini, the neighborhood. One thing is what's been happening in Syria, but the EU's paid particular attention in terms of assistance programs to Lebanon, Jordan, countries that are carrying huge amounts of refugees per capita, way above even Turkey's numbers. Are you concerned about a spillover? What is the EU doing to try and make sure that those refugees that are there have an opportunity for the long term? They may not be able to go back, who knows for how long. There's a risk still that Syria expands and explodes as many people had feared over time. What are your biggest worries in that region around Syria at the moment, and what are you doing about it?
What we're doing, is it on? Yes. What we're doing is, as I said before, we are the ones supporting not only the humanitarian aid inside Syria, by the way, with offices on the ground. The European Union, as the UN, has offices both in Damascus, still, this is not so much known, but they are purely humanitarian offices that are operating still in Damascus and in Gaziantep for the north. So we are there on the ground with our people, supporting the UN agencies and international NGOs in Syria, but mainly and also very strongly in the neighboring countries. We are the ones financing the schools for the children, the Syrian children, being it in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey. In Turkey, I would like to underline this, with a major problem of language that sometimes we don't focus enough on, because obviously the Syrian children in Lebanon or in Jordan don't have the same language problem for going to school, but when it comes to Turkey, we risk to have a full generation of Syrian children that don't learn Arabic or have a difficulty in education there. So that is why we are focusing so much on education programs, including in Turkey, for Syrians that are people that are highly sophisticated, educated. I would stress what Staffan was saying. We should talk with them more and hear the level of knowledge and awareness of the challenges they will have for the future, and the willingness to go back and rebuild their country, the pride of being Syrians, no matter what kind of background. So what we're doing is this: support for the refugees in the camps, in the local communities, and support to the local hosting communities, especially in Jordan and Lebanon, because we have to avoid that the social tensions of those communities hosting the refugees explodes, creating more problems in Lebanon and Jordan. That are countries that in themselves are facing complicated times. So we're doing that kind of work in the camps, outside of the camps, supporting the hosting communities, but also working with them on the political solution, because they have, as well as other neighboring countries, a knowledge, a familiarity, I would say, with Syria, for good or for bad. I mean, the region has its own complicated story, but they can understand the dynamics in the country better than we do, and still we are close. We are Mediterraneans. We understand the mentality, or that big international powers can, that can have, again, the military power, but not necessarily the soft power to interact with the Syrian players. So we are working also with them to find ways to build this common ground. And again, you mentioned the Lebanon case. For instance, I find it extremely interesting in this moment when Lebanon has finally a president, has hopefully finally also a new government that can help the international community understand the shortcomings or the peculiarities of the Lebanon model. Personally, I do not believe that the Lebanon model would work anywhere but in Lebanon. Lebanon is a miracle in itself. I think not repeatable, not possible to duplicate anywhere else. I think Syria will have to find its own model, but for sure it will be a model that, as Staffan was saying, cannot turn back the time simply because it wouldn't work. And the challenge there is this. This is what we're discussing with our regional friends. What kind of system, what kind of practice can keep together the power sharing, the participation, not even only protection, but participation of all components of the Syrian society to the running of the country, to the governance of the country. So not only a logic of a majority that rules the country, protecting the minorities, but all the different components taking an active stance in the reconstruction of the civil and political life of the country. And the regional players and the neighbors creating this space that can allow them to do so. The space goes also with a little bit of encouragement, and some players have more leverage than others in this encouragement. But we have to put in the picture more the Syrians and the region, because so far we've tried hard the international card. It has worked for a certain time. Now I believe it's really time for the region and the Syrians to come in a bit more prominently.
So, yeah, I think models for local governance as and when they can be created would be incredibly important. Stefan, just coming back to you for a second, we're right in the middle of a vicious campaign in Mosul to try to evict Daesh from that particular city. Raqqa has not been yet tackled. Are you concerned that there could be an unforeseen set of spillovers from the work to defeat Daesh that could spill back somehow into Syria or spill over into other neighboring countries? We were caught by surprise the first time by the push that Daesh made. How concerned are you that somehow this is something that can come around from the side and affect the kind of steps that you and others are trying to take within Syria itself?
I am, but I must say, frankly, let's talk about what the main concern today is. The main concern today is Aleppo. And all the rest is taking place. It's likely to take place more slowly or more faster. No question about Mosul, probably Raqqa as well, perhaps even some movement before the end of the year. But today is Aleppo. So on Aleppo, let me correct some perceptions that I heard yesterday, perhaps. The UN is there, okay? And so is thanks to EU funding and to many of our partners, but particularly thanks to EU. The UN is there. We are present with 15 people. The situation is the following, just to put it into context. Imagine the following. In Aleppo today, there are 400,000 IDPs. Not in the last few weeks. Yep. They've been moving from now more than 2 years. Probably more, Federica, than how many Syrian IDPs or refugees are in the whole Europe. So you can see the effort that Aleppo as a city is taking. In the last few days, 30,500 people have moved, many of them children. The biggest problem is shelter, by the way. Yeah. Shelter. It's winter, it's cold, they don't know where to stay. You must have seen the pictures. The houses are destroyed, bombed from both sides, but particularly now. So you have that. We are bringing now food. We are trying to bring 18 tons of medicine, so it's not correct that we are not doing it. What we cannot do is actually reaching the people in what is left in Eastern Aleppo, because part of Eastern Aleppo has not yet gone, and there's a substantial population there, perhaps more than 100,000 people, and there are still fighters in it, and al-Nusra. So my appeal to al-Nusra is, for God's sake, move out. We have been telling you for a long time, move out, go wherever you want, but don't stay in Aleppo.
But to what extent can one detach al-Nusra? I mean, I've seen some reports written, which strike me as being reasonably credible, that part of the strategy of Russian bombing and the regime bombing, in a way, has been to destroy the differentiation between al-Nusra and other opposition groups, to drive the former into the arms of the latter, to, in a way, make it impossible for the West to be able to create this neat distinction between that's al-Nusra bad, these are the other opposition groups good. Can you really make this call, al-Nusra leave? What does that mean in today's world?
Well,
Surely the lines are lost.
It means figures. 900 people are al-Nusra. Everybody knows who they are. They know who they are. They are linked to Al-Qaeda. The UN resolution says they are terrorists. There are moments when they should decide and have the courage, the moral courage, to live. That will stop the reason why Russia and Syria is saying that they need to take over by force Eastern Aleppo because there is a terrorist group there.
But it will fall. Eastern Aleppo will fall then, and
well, what
on.
We need to do is to avoid that whatever changes taking place in Eastern Aleppo, the reality is there is a moment of conflict,
yep.
And war is made of war sometimes, and we need to prepare for peace, but also to protect the people, to reduce the violence to the maximum. And I must say there has been some interesting developments in terms of negotiations, which have been facilitated by some neighboring countries, in order to avoid that what happened in Eastern Aleppo became a massacre. No surprise that there has been a change. Bottom line on this, The priority is to avoid that eastern Aleppo changes or developments, which seem to be unavoidable, are not painful for the people of Syria. And we should be involved in doing that and allowed to do that.
Very big. I don't know if you want to come in on this point, and we're coming down to the last few minutes of this panel, but I wanted to bring the relationship with Turkey in on your side. It's such a critical partner. Obviously, it's had a fairly mobile policy towards Syria, but a critical partner for the EU in the post-conflict phase as well. Can you just give us an update on where you think the relationship is with Turkey right now, vis-a-vis Syria in particular?
Thanks for the specification. No, but first let me say one thing on Aleppo, because I feel, and let me go on a personal note here. I feel a certain, I'm not that much at ease in the way in which we are now given for granted that this is gone. I might be the only person in the room, but I feel quite, I don't think it is correct from our side to say, as I've seen that in these days we're saying, well, Aleppo is gone, it's lost, and then let's think to this next step, being it Raqqa, being it how we manage the rest. I still feel that we have a political, a moral duty and responsibility. First, to protect the civilians, humanitarian corridors to let the civilians out of the city. In the same time as we try to bring the humanitarian aid in, food and medicines. First. Second, I still feel that we have a political and humanitarian responsibility and duty to call for a stop of the strikes. Yep. It seems that we're simply forgetting that there is a reason for that. Sure, war is war. War is war, and civilians need to be protected even in times of war. We have international conventions for that. And from the European Union side, you will always hear the voice calling for a stop of the airstrikes on Aleppo and a protection of civilians.
But if we call and we don't offer consequences when the call isn't heard, how does that make the EU strong?
We should still continue. We should still push.
Yeah, my main concern, and I hope you can understand this. You can be cynical up to a certain point only. My main concern is not the strength of Europe in this moment. My main concern is the people in Aleppo. So that is my focus. And I'm sorry, but I know that was a reference to sanctions. I don't believe that having sanctions tomorrow on one or two entities, which we're doing, by the way, we have 230-something Syrians sanctioned in this moment, and this have not prevented military escalations to happen. It is a possible way of pressure always, but it doesn't have an immediate effect. It can have a symbolic or a political effect or a long-term effect, or it can be a push to enter into negotiations with the perspective of lifting them if you enter into negotiations. But what you do tomorrow to save the people in Aleppo, still, I think we have to work hardly every single day on this. And I believe this is not out of the picture of the work we're doing. This is not out of the picture of what the European Union is doing. I know this is not out of the picture of what the UN is doing. This is a priority. We cannot pass the message that Aleppo is lost, we turn the page, we move forward. No, we still need to save the people in Aleppo, to protect the civilians, to call for a stop in the airstrikes. And again, I think Paolo said it the other day, no peace process will be easy on the ruins of Aleppo. No one has an interest in destroying the city, killing other people, and then looking at what we do next. This will make only things worse. And by the way, I'm convinced the fall of Aleppo will not end the war. We will have other military escalations. So if a call to stop has to be made now, not tomorrow or in a week's time. Turkey, the easy part of the question. I'll focus only on Syria, and this helps me also to say that the relations between the European Union and Turkey are, Facebook would say complicated, but also very intense. You cannot have a complicated relation if it's not a real, true, intense relationship, and covers many different aspects. Media have been focusing mainly on the refugee issue. I always recall our European friends that the refugee crisis is not a crisis for Europe, it's a crisis for refugees, first of all. And we have to be a bit calm on that. We can manage. And I know that Filippo Grandi said important things here yesterday that I share. But our relation with Turkey goes far beyond this. It's about Cyprus, and I would like to underline in these days, important, very important. It's about Syria, it's about economic ties, and so on. And internal developments in Turkey, by the way, but this is for another panel. On Syria, Turkey is one of the countries with which, in the region, we are starting this work on the post-conflict scenario, and the reconstruction, and the reconciliation. I see Turkey is evolving its Syria policy in these months. It's not for me to comment on that or to describe this evolution, but we clearly see this. And we will have to see how this materializes in real terms. But I see that there is, I would like to finish with this. I think there is a space. I clearly see this. There is a space among the main regional players on some common ground for the future of Syria, which might also lead to a bit more of that, which might also lead to a bit of common ground for a security architecture in the region that might finally bring us a little bit less of proxy wars, because we have many of them around, and a way of living together next to each other, because you don't change geography at the end of the day. This is what Europeans have learned. After thousands of years of war, at a certain moment, after the Second World War, we understood that it was much more convenient for us to live in peace. And we started with economic cooperation. The European Union started like this, when we found out it was more convenient for us to stop fighting each other and starting trading with each other. Maybe in the Middle East there is enough pragmatism to understand that it would be more convenient for all to trade instead of killing each other.
That's an optimistic call and an important one to make. Stefan, if you had one thing that you'd like to see done differently right now, what could be done in these next few weeks, in the next months? What step would you call on? Let's take this opportunity of this Med Summit to make that call.
3, then. Can you allow me 3?
If they're quick, because it says time's up there. And I know
it was time up for a while
yeah,
now.
Well, it sounds like Syria. So
okay.
this is,
Okay, 3. The first one, let me look at you, Paolo. I think your idea of a Helsinki arrangement should not be abandoned. Because when you look at the issue between the tensions between two main countries in particular in the region, has an impact on Yemen, on Lebanon, on Syria, on Iraq. And in Lebanon, there seems to have been found a solution. It's true, Lebanon is a wonderfully special country, but there are possibilities. So I think we need to help and work on that. We did it in Europe, in the West. We should help that to be done. Now, 2 others. One is Aleppo. We need to push all together for whatever happens in Aleppo, that the population, the civilians, are protected. If we are pushing for that, it will be in the interest of the civilian population. But frankly, as I think Federica was referring to, it would be the interest of everyone. I can't imagine President Putin talking to President Trump on the 21st of January and having a discussion about Syria with Aleppo destroyed and a massacre there. I don't think that would be a good thing to imagine. And therefore, I imagine that everyone has the interest of avoiding that. And to a certain degree, that is still possible. And third, if I had to ask for one real thing, I would like those who have an influence of President Assad to tell him, contact the UN, please, and tell the UN, the Secretary General, this and the coming Secretary General, I am ready for a political devolution. I'm ready for a real negotiation, not just for calling a meeting in Geneva. I've done already 3 times that. And when the delegation comes and says, you can't talk about that, you can't talk about that, you can't talk about that. The only thing you can talk about terrorism. Time now for a real negotiation. If I get that noise, we will have the discussions and the political dialogue on a real ground tomorrow.
Federica. Last word to you.
I use part of it to clap stuff. I fully share his, what is it, wishes for Christmas? No, in the immediate. So I will focus on two in the midterm, I hope mid and not long term. One is that we help the region. And the region goes from the Mediterranean to the Gulf to the borders of Iran with Afghanistan, to find or invent a way of living next to each other, if not liking each other, at least accepting each other. Again, we've done this in Europe, Germany and France, Germany and Poland, Italy and Germany. We've managed to do that. I am 100% sure that the region has in itself the strength and the wisdom to get to this kind of security architecture for the region. And we can help, and we would be delighted to help, first. Second, it's a big wish. If we manage to take the religion out of this, because this has nothing to do with religion. Shia and Sunni have been living together for centuries, in the same countries, in the same villages. This is spoiling the rest of the world. From Africa to Asia, to Europe, to the Middle East. Want to make a conflict, but don't cover it with a religious approach. I know the next panel will deal with that. But I see this religious cover of a geopolitical fight as the most dangerous poison that the region can spread in the rest of the world. So, first, maybe I should turn this around. First, let's try to have a detox exercise and bring the religious aspects where they belong, which is a very serious place, and leave the geopolitics and the religious spheres distinct. Second, having the Secretary General of the Arab League clapping on this is a very encouraging sign for me. Second, is the more positive. Engage with each other. If you want, we can offer a space in building. You can call it an Helsinki approach. You can call it, maybe it's not by chance that the three of us are Italian. Engage in a way of building a system that allows neighbors to accept the fact that they're neighbors and they can live with each other without making war.
Look, thank you for a very strong call. And on the back of that call, let's please give obviously we'll give a very strong hand, but I think on the back of that call, it is where on the back of the tragedy of Syria and the lives that have been lost, let's make sure they have not been wasted. I think this is what both of you are calling for. This has been a dreadful tragedy. It goes on today, this minute, tonight, tomorrow, it will continue. Let's not waste it. Let's make the best out of it. So very strong hand for the panel, please. Thank you very much.